Right, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Gina van Makkelberg. I'm part of the marketing team at Netacea. I'm going to quickly run through a few housekeeping points before introducing and handing over to our speakers today. So first, please note that we are recording today's session. A link to the recording will be shared with you via email tomorrow, so you can rewatch if you wish and share with any interested colleagues. Second, we do have a few handouts available for download in the GoToWebinar panel. These will give you a bit more information about Netacea and our smarter bot management approach. And finally, we will also be taking questions at the end of the webinar. If you do have any questions you'd like to submit, please send them in via the questions section on the GoToWebinar panel, and Scott and James will answer as many of them as they can at the end of the webinar. I'd now like to introduce you to our presenters today. We're delighted to have with us Scott Helme as a guest speaker. Scott is a security researcher, international speaker, and consultant, and will be taking us through his experience of bots as both a security expert and founder of a popular online security service. I'm also joined by James Maud, Netacea's head of threat intelligence. James has a broad scope in cybersecurity research, and today he'll be looking at the evolving threat landscape around bots and why traditional defenses are falling a bit short. And with that, I'll now hand you over to Scott.
Thank you very much. So yeah, welcome. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate being here and being able to talk about some of the experiences, as you said, that I've had myself running my own online service. So just a very, very quick, brief bit of background about me. I've been in security research independently for quite a while. I've been involved in some kind of rather large bits of research. I've been very fortunate to feature on a few different kind of TV programs and do kind of commentary on that. And even more recently in things like the newly found TalkTalk data breach. So I did get to experience quite a lot of the public-facing incidents as well as the things that I handle myself. And just before we jump in, I want to share actually, and James doesn't know that I'm doing this, James and I have actually taken part in a TV show, although very briefly we were actually on television together. And this is probably a couple of years ago now, I think. So we do have a little bit of experience here with hacking with Hawaiian garlands as well. So to get things kicked off, I kind of want to start out here with a little bit of background information on, first of all, what is a bot? Now, I appreciate many people here are probably at least somewhat familiar with the problem, but I think and feel that this kind of question is almost like when we used to use the term cloud, and everyone kind of knows what it means and knows what the cloud is, but it's like, what exactly is it? What exactly happens underneath? So for me, bots and the bots that I've seen and come across and have to deal with can take many different forms, starting right down at the most basic element of it. You know, this could be a tiny little script, maybe usually written in something like Python, that is going to come to your website and perform some interaction, go to your API, make some kind of submission. So they can really start out as really basic, very simple, easy to generate and easy to run tools that are essentially going to automate something against your site. More recently, we've actually, and again, I've seen this myself, is like headless browsers. So if you imagine a web browser coming to your site just without the visible part of the screen that a user interacts with. Of course, if a bot is running the browser engine, it doesn't need the screen, it doesn't need to kind of see the visual elements. So you can actually run what we call a headless browser, like headless Chrome, and essentially run that on a server without having to have the visual element for a person to see. Or even compromised servers, compromised computers can be used to launch these bot attacks from. So I often see a lot of traffic coming from compromised machines. If a computer is running malware, someone will leverage that to launch a bot attack from there. So they can take many different shapes and forms, and many of these different types of bots are things that I've had to deal with myself because I do run my own online service. And when you run an online service, I'm sure like many people here, many people on the call, you have different things to contend with. So we have a login form, for example. Now, our hope and our expectation is that genuine users will come along to this form, they'll type in their email and password, they'll log in and use our service as you would kind of imagine. But now this is a great opportunity for someone to come and use a bot to do perhaps something like what we call credential stuffing. So if someone on the internet finds a data breach from another service, they aggregate a list of emails and passwords together, and they may come and test those passwords against our service. Now, especially as a security focused service, we provide a security product. If someone were to successfully find a username and password combination to log in here, this could be potentially quite a bad thing. So we're very aware of the ability and the threat of bots coming to this and trying things like credential stuffing. We also, of course, have marketing. We have a registration form. We go out and we will do different exercises and events in order to try and drive interest in the service. So we want people to come here and register, and we look at those statistics, and they're really important to us. They're things that we invest time and effort and thought in. But if our registrations are all just being done by bots, and we're sat there thinking, hey, this is great, we've had 1,000 registrations this week, and actually there was only 8 registrations and the other 992 were bots, then that could be particularly costly. It could throw us off our game. We could misunderstand the success of something that we're doing. So we really need the information that comes from things like this to be from actual real people, real users, not from bots. And one of the other really big ones for us, and again, I'm sure many other services will have this, is payment. So we have payment forms. We want people to come to our service, use our free account, perhaps upgrade, but at some point, there is the ability for a credit card to be put in there. And we've seen many attacks like these where bots will come along and take a whole batch of card data, and essentially they're trying to test if the card data is valid and if it's real. Like, can we do like a small transaction to just test if this card is even real, if it's valid, if it's going to get declined, if it will be successful, and then we know we have a valid credit card information. So they're the kind of really common ones, and to identify these, we essentially went through our process of threat modeling, where we sit and look at our site and say, what is the potential risk here? Like, what would a bot come to our site and what would it do? Now, the visible pages here that a person like you or I could interact with are obviously top candidates on people's list, but there are other parts of our application as well, because we have a large API behind our application that receives data from clients and web browsers out on the web. And those clients interact with us by sending us JSON data. So this is an open API that people and things and entities can call into. And again, we see a really large problem here where this is an example piece of JSON on the screen, and this is the kind of thing we would expect to receive, and it's a piece of telemetry, it's a report. And we see lots of these reports and lots of data being sent to us that are just either good replicas of a real report, but they are fraudulent, and they're being submitted in an automated fashion by bots towards our reporting endpoint. So it's not just the visible and kind of the parts of the application where people will interact, like login and registration. You also need to think, do we have an API behind our application? Have you got a smartphone application which will most likely interact with an API as well? So there's lots of different parts of your application that you have to consider here. And this is something that we have considered, and that we, over time as we've grown, we've had to spend more kind of thought and more process on this. So one of our first steps, and one of the things that I most commonly come across in terms of people trying to mitigate like essentially like the bad bots on the web, is to use things like a recapture. So this was one of the first things I have to say that we did. It's really kind of low friction. It's a great first step, and it's an effective mechanism. If you come to our registration page, you can see that we've got the V3 recapture, which is the invisible one. And the reason that we opted for that was, a lot of the time where you're trying to stop these bad bots getting to your site, the measures that you implement usually have a bad impact on the user. So I'm pretty sure everyone here has probably gone to a site and thought, oh, I've got to like click that I'm not a robot, and then I have to click on all the fire hydrants to prove that I'm not a robot. And we end up with these kind of bot countermeasures being a detriment to the user experience. And I really don't want to implement a measure that will be bad for our users when they come to our site. And recapture, the V3 one here, the invisible one, it's a good step towards removing that barrier, because at least you don't have to click the button. However, I still hear commonly people like, great, I came to your website and I've got to like click on all the pictures of a traffic light, and I would just like to register and not have this inconvenience. So, this is kind of a necessity. We have to have something on our registration page. This was a good first step. But we have other problems as well. Things, again, like on our registration page, we would hope that a user would come along and they will make their request and say, I would like to load the page, I would like to log in, I would like to do something. And we actively monitor for clients for things that look like browsers but have perhaps too many requests. So this is one of the other things that we see, is that a client will come along and start flooding us with these requests. Maybe they're trying username and password combinations on the login, or they're trying to spam us and flood us with false registrations. So this is something, again, one of our first kind of problems and forays into mitigating this was around rate limiting. So we're saying, okay, we expect a particular client will only send us maybe 1 request per second. So, you know, if the client exceeds that, then maybe we will start pushing them back and rejecting some of those high volume bits of traffic. So again, this comes with its downsides though. You know, what if the user is just like clicking around a few pages quite quickly, or if it's a building with many members of staff in, then all of those members of staff come to our information portal, we could misconceive that as a potential attack of like, there are too many people interacting from the same, what appears to us as the same IP. So as a result of that, our rate limits are fairly relaxed. Like, we can't too aggressively apply these limits, which makes the defense mechanism less effective, because now you're having to back it off because the cost is the user experience. And you know, one of the kind of drawbacks of this simple IP rate limiting is it can be easily bypassed as well. If an attacker at a bot network coming towards our service has many source IP addresses, and you can access a botnet of thousands of IPs quite cheaply and easily now, then they can essentially bypass the rate limit by increasing the number of source IP addresses for the attack. Very similar to the recapture thing. They're easily bypassed. They're great first steps, and you know, they're kind of the steps 1 and 2 that we took and that I see other people take. But if you want to take this further, then you know, you have to go beyond this. We have to try and start getting a little bit smarter about the things that we do, rather than just like the rate limit, applying this universally to all traffic. How about we try and apply these things to traffic based on what we think about it? What is our view of this particular client? Is there a good chance that they're a bot, or is it a low chance that they're a bot? And essentially give them some kind of rating. So when we start talking about reputation now, when someone comes to our website, we can let them through and let them interact with our service. But if we have kind of a thought that they're a low quality client, that they have a low reputation, then we can restrict them from doing sensitive things. So they can come to our site and load our homepage, maybe they can browse around or even log in. But if they go and say, all right, let's, you know, try and sign up with a credit card, or if you're already signed up with a credit card, let's change the billing address. So these are quite sensitive actions on the site, and something that we might be able to prevent a low reputation client from doing. But on the flip side of that, if someone comes to the service and logs in and we're like, yeah, you know, everything looks good, we have a really low expectation that this particular client could be a bot, then we can allow them to exercise the full use of our application. So this is like a really short journey that we took in terms of, I feel like we're very much at the beginning of trying to combat the bad bot problem, because you know, the other conscious thing in the back of our mind here is that there are actually good bots. And you know, whenever I see conversations about bots, I feel like it's viewed as a bad thing. And when, you know, I think we need to make that distinction that there are good bots and that there are bad bots. So for example, the Google bot, I really want the Google bot to come to our site and crawl it and index it and help us with our SEO. So if our bot defenses are prohibiting that from happening, then that's actually going to be detrimental to us as well. So there's a lot of balance there in between, you know, what is the kind of bot that we want to mitigate, which is the bad ones, and what kind of bots do we want to allow through. So as we go on this journey, and this is essentially kind of where we're up to almost right now with report-uri and with our service, is we want to continue to push this forward. So we need to get a little bit smarter about how we do this. All of our current measures are applied universally to all visitors without any consideration of whether they could be a bot or not, or to increase them, if you know, increase these measures if the bot has a bad reputation. And essentially this is kind of why I'm here with Netacea talking about this. Is, you know, this is the next step essentially, is to try and take some more dedicated solution that handles this problem a little better. It's not applied in a universal measure against all traffic, and it has that slightly smarter approach, because I feel like a lot of the current things are so broad and they're applied to all traffic without any consideration of good bot or bad bot, or you know, good traffic or otherwise. It doesn't seem like right now that the current measures that we have are essentially tackling the problem. So this is why I've been really open to coming and joining Netacea and talking on this, is that I really want to understand this problem better, and how do we essentially go forwards and start to do something better than what we currently have. So I want to say thank you for allowing me to have that, you know, that time to take you through this, and I'm hoping to open things up with James now and actually try and, see what would be the next steps. What is the problem? Do I understand the problem fully? And is there things that we need to look at in a slightly better way?
Yeah, thank you very much, Scott. That was interesting, and I think you've got an interesting take on it there, and you're slightly ahead of the curve with your approach, and you're ahead of quite a lot of people's thinking in this area. One thing you mentioned there was something like Googlebot, and that's a great example where you have a known good bot that you want to come to your site. But we were doing a client engagement this week, and we saw 6 different Google bots. One of them was real, 5 of them were fake Google bots, because people spoof the user agent, unless the client's doing a reverse.
So they're trying to impersonate the Google bot to get through. Okay.
And this is kind of the antithesis of what you're talking about there, of these defenses we put in place where we say we have very crude ways of dealing with it at the moment. It's this broad brush approach of this is a good user agent, this is a bad user agent, or this is a good IP, this is a bad IP. So when we're looking at these things, unless you're going to do, through your WAF or through your CDN or reverse DNS lookup on each Google bot to see if it's actually coming from, a known good source, then suddenly your whitelist can be used against you. All that data coming from a client can be impersonated in the same way that a headless browser impersonates the fact that it's trying to look like a real user with a real browser. The user agent can be spoofed, all these things can be changed. And, the attackers, some of them aren't very sophisticated, but some of them are very sophisticated. They know what browsers and what combinations of things look the most realistic. They can just look at what are the top 10 most popular user agents on the internet, spoof those, spoof mobile devices, spoof the user agents of your own applications. We see that a lot on mobile devices where you have a particular user agent from your own app, and they can just reverse engineer that and then spoof that back to you. So you think your own legitimate app is querying you, and actually it's just an attacker who's written a Python script to do that.
I think the word crude there is probably actually really good. Like, I feel that's probably a fair word, and the correct one is that our current measures are fairly crude. And I imagine there's probably applications and site owners out there that I guess that those crude measures would be sufficient for, right? Because you've got to look at the threat of bots and think it's like everything in security. It's all about layers, So we've taken layers like 1 and 2, step 1 and 2. Do we need to go further? Like, is there enough reason for us to do so? And I imagine some people will fall below that, and some people will think, actually, we need to go a little bit further.
Absolutely. And if we think about the tooling we have, it has been built for a purpose of, the WAFs and the security tooling we have at the moment. We've built things to do rate limiting. We've built things to block based on IP. We've built things to protect against software vulnerabilities, open ports, all these kind of things, services being exposed to the internet. And then we're trying to apply this to protecting our websites. And these attacks aren't sort of traditional security attacks. They're not the way we think of, a lot of security professionals think of attacks. They're attacks against business logic. Your login page is legitimate functionality for your business. You need that for people to log in. So suddenly, how is your WAF supposed to distinguish between a real user creating an account or a bot creating an account? The tools don't have that level of insight into the behavior and the traffic and what's going on to be able to make those decisions for you. So that's where I think the crude thing comes in. We're trying to repurpose tools that weren't designed for this.
And I guess that's going kind of back into both the user experience problem, and user experience is a huge thing for me in security, because I constantly feel like every time we try and improve security, we're somehow causing inconvenience or problems for users. And I really don't, as the owner of a service and a security professional, like the security part of me is like more security. And then the owner of the business is like, well, I really don't want to bug my users. And I feel like every time we try and fix one, we detriment the other, and we end up with security and usability competing. And I guess that ties into the
absolutely. When we talk to clients, especially in retail, and we'll come on to this in another slide, but I'll just touch on it briefly. Things like Recapture or 2-factor authentication, it seems like such an obvious thing to a security professional, but that can halve your click-through rates. Impulse purchases. You're in a competitive environment. I think fortunately with services like yourself, you're in quite a unique position where people really want to come to you for a particular thing. But if you're in a competitive landscape in finance, in retail, online gaming, all that kind of thing, every time you introduce friction, your competitors look more easier to use because they don't have the friction there.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that.
Yeah. So let's kick off some of these slides. So the internet isn't fair. Sounds like an obvious statement, but I think people don't realize how unfair the internet actually is. From you want to go and buy a ticket. Sorry, a ticketing bot's stolen it and is selling it at twice the price now. Your teenage son wants to buy some new trainers. Sorry, someone with a sneaker bot has gone and bought the latest release of those trainers and is selling them on eBay for a huge profit. You can't get tickets to the theatre. Your website, when you're trying to load a website during a sale, it's slowed down, the inventory isn't there. Your credentials are breached by one organization and then used to try and attack hundreds of different businesses. Like Scott says, he hasn't caused a credential breach on the internet, yet he is suffering from other users' credential breaches. And it was only a few years ago when, to a certain extent, I used to talk to IT security professionals, and it used to be a little chuckle about some other business has been breached. Thank goodness it wasn't us, it's someone else's problem. Now it is your problem, because there are so many credentials online, it's so ubiquitous, and users are still reusing those time and time again. So they've been used to stuff credentials. You want to take payments online, you can be an attack vector for that. So some of the statistics that jump out at me, on average, 40% of login attacks on the enterprise customers we work with are attempts by bots. On some e-commerce platforms, we've seen in excess of 90% of logging attempts being automated bots trying to do credential stuffing or brute force credentials. There's a lot of fraud losses. Again, people don't often only come across the bot problem when they're working backwards. They're seeing fraud happening on customer accounts, loyalty points are stolen, fake transactions, all that kind of thing. And then months down the line, they work it back and realize it traced back to a credential stuffing attack that led to an account takeover attack that led to goods and services being procured. Again, cause of website downtime. A lot of people that we talk to initially think they have a DDoS problem. They think they're seeing huge volumes of attack and they're looking for DDoS solutions, and they start digging into it and actually realize, hang on, this is just coming after our login path, or this is just coming after our check-in path. And actually, it's bot activity. We talk to a lot of customers who are putting up a lot of resources and having to really scale their websites to cope with bots. Because the statistic there, 97% of resources were used serving serving content to bots. I'll get my words out eventually. And that was with a particular person in the travel sector we work with. And the reason that is because bots aren't interested in cached content. They're hammering for your real-time pricing, your real-time product information, your real-time feeds of data. They don't care about the content that your CDN is caching. They want live data. They're hammering you in every way they can. So it consumes a huge amount of resources. Your website slows down. Your ops team are fighting with it. They think it's a DDoS attack. All these problems. And this has been rising to the forefront over the past few years. There's this ZDNet article here that bad bots are not only stealing customer data, but they're also ruining the customer experience. So this is bad for you as an organization. You're risking being breached. Scott touched on some of the things of marketing analytics. You might think a product is really hot. They're getting a lot of interest in it. You might do a marketing campaign, see huge numbers of hits. Is that real users, or is that just automated bot scraping? Yeah. Is that the competitors scraping your site? We've seen things where retail websites have suffered from suddenly there's all these requests to their checkout path, and the competitor is literally enumerating through all their goods and services what their delivery costs would look like just with automated scripts. So it can prove a huge risk. But the thing is, again, what we talked about earlier was this is around business logic attacks. And this is one of the challenges we face when it comes to this threat of it doesn't just impact the security team, it impacts the marketing team, the ops team, all sorts of people within the business. So it crosses different silos, different boundaries. But fundamentally, the tools we're using often aren't equipped to handle this. The other thing is when we take that broad brush approach, as well as it being crude to a certain extent, the tools we have, is that every company has a different business logic. So every company has a different potential for a bot attack. And it's really important, like you mentioned about risk, Scott, just to think about your risk to your organization. Do that as an exercise, do some threat modeling and think about all the different threats that can face your business, all the ways you can come at that. So for example, finance, there's a lot of talk at the moment, and we have a lot of interest working with customers around open banking and PSD2s, where they are opening up new APIs to ways so fintechs and other banking institutions can talk to each other, conduct transactions. So a user can have a mobile app that can talk to 3 different bank accounts, 3 different banking providers, and aggregate all that data in one. So not only are they, so potentially increasing their attack service there, they're having a new way that people can try and stuff in credentials through these third parties, these aggregator sites. And they're also worried about, what's happening with the scraping on my website. So traditionally, to get around the lack of open APIs, these aggregator services have just scraped the website. They've logged in as the user, they've scraped the bank account information. So what happens when you release your mobile API? You want to make sure that only real people are using that for legitimate purposes, and then you can kind of start to turn the screws and turn off the scraping on your website, because you don't want that. A lot of banks and fintechs have operated in this space, it's been tolerated, but as this rolls out, this shouldn't be tolerated anymore, and they know this. So there's multiple challenges there. Loyalty schemes, there's some research recently where people are talking about Forget about Bitcoin, Ethereum, although at the moment, very hot if you've got it. But loyalty point schemes and these kind of credit balances you get from gift cards and membership points are really adding up and becoming a dark web currency. So you can go on there, steal someone's loyalty points, and there's huge marketplaces for reselling this. You know, some of the big retailers out there, people often think about it and look at why someone Credential stuffed Dunkin' Donuts twice in the past year? Well, they have a loyalty point scheme. You can go and buy $50 worth of free Dunkin' Donuts for $10 online. You know, you can buy these, access these stolen accounts. Streaming services, again, extremely popular. If you have a Spotify family plan, I urge you to go in and log in and look and see any of the slots that you haven't used, whether they've been resold on the dark web, because again, it's a very common thing. A friend of mine actually had this problem, and they only learned that their Spotify account had been breached when they were listening to music on their smart home system, and suddenly some death metal came on. Their account had been resold, someone was trying to play music somewhere else, and this weird duel ensued between them trying to play their music on their smart system and someone else trying to play something else, and it coming out their speakers. So weird situations like that can occur. And then the price scraping, you know, just people hammering your site for pricing information, trying to steal inventory, trying to hoard inventory. So we see this a lot with ticketing, with luxury goods, where people will try and add things in the basket whilst trying to simultaneously sell them on a third-party site. And they keep spinning them in the basket, keep adding them, keeping there as long as possible. And as soon as they've sold it, they'll then go through to checkout and complete the purchase. So there's no risk to them. They're not buying things until they're actually sold at a profit. So, you know, really simple things. And there's a whole ecosystem and a whole place built around this online. There's proxy networks, there's servers, there's software, there's all sorts of packages out there just to buy strange looking trainers online. Payment gateways, again, a lot of retailers or people like yourself, Scott, who have a payment gateway get targeted just because it's a way to validate credit card details.
Yeah.
And again, if you're thinking about risk modeling in your business logic, can someone get to your payment gateway without having to authenticate, without having to log in and create an account? Because if they can do and just add a card very quickly, an attacker can then use that. Suddenly your payment gateway provider is fining you for, you know, checking stolen card details, you risk being cut off. When you come to renewal, your fees are higher, so it can cause huge amounts of problem there. Airlines, travel companies, again, inventory sniping, holding things in baskets, so all kinds of different things. One of the interesting points that you've cottoned onto quite early as well is risk, in terms of most people think of this as a browser-based problem. So you're saying, you know, you've got your login, your person comes along through the web browser and authenticates, and you can maybe put some recapture or something in front of that. Might not be the best experience, but it kind of works. But actually, what happens when it's a mobile device? And increasingly, we're seeing, you know, over 50% of traffic now is mobile and API calls for a lot of organizations. So suddenly your mobile devices are part of that picture. What can you do to mitigate the traffic there, things coming from mobile devices? Can you use the same methods either through the mobile browsers or through the native applications? APIs as well, you know, maybe your mobile device talks through an API, maybe there's other software, or maybe there's third parties. And this again is a really interesting thing that we're seeing more and more of, is you put all these measures in place to protect your website, your services, and then give partner access, and someone uses that third party to stuff in credentials, to validate card details, to scrape information. So you're trying to protect your website, and actually through a partner, through some sort of syndication, through a third-party app that's designed to work with your systems, suddenly that's your attack vector. So people's attack surface is increasing all the time, and most, you know, organizations now have a plan for more APIs, more mobile, more business-to-business transactions, and this is where a lot of the attacks are coming from. And if we look at why companies are struggling to stop bots, you know, we've got a huge number of people registered for this webinar today from a diverse range of industries, and they're all trying to do things already, like yourself, to stop the bot attacks that are out there.
Yeah.
So, you know, block or rate limit is usually the first step that people talk about. And this becomes very hard because if you think about blocking, what are you going to block on? You're going to potentially block on maybe a user agent. Well, if they're spoofing a legitimate user agent, you can cut off a huge number of real customers. Maybe you try and block an IP, but like you say, how do you know who else is behind that IP?
Yeah.
You know, what else is happening there? And that's, you know, one of the challenges. Rate limiting, again, it's very easy for attacks to be very distributed and fly under rate limits. You know, as soon as you hit a rate limit as an attacker, you know that's the ceiling, and as long as you stay under that, like you're going to be fine. Yeah.
One request less,
so you just drop 10 requests off that, and just to be safe, and then suddenly you can increase that. And we see this a lot of the time where people are trying to, when we do POCs with customers, and they have this in place where the attacks bounce off the ceiling for a little bit and then just slide underneath and stay there.
Yep.
Or even when people will launch smokescreen DDoS style attacks to hit the rate limit from obvious things like data centers. There's the usual offenders out there with cheap hosting. And then at the same time, they're using a residential proxy network to actually fly under the radar. Now they've worked out what the rate limit is. Capture there, it does have its place. But again, if you're working with partners and APIs and all these other things, where does it sit? How does that work? And then the kind of more advanced things, the dedicated bot vendors, some of the CDN providers and WAFs out there, maybe try and inject some code to profile users' behavior. So if we're looking at those, the block and the limit, well, residential proxies. This is a screenshot of a website that sells residential proxies, guaranteed to be anonymous. They're not going to log what you're doing with their proxies, and guaranteed to be 100% whitelisted. They're collecting residential IP ranges. The way they do this is they offer things like SDKs that monetize apps. So your people come along, they download an app from the App Store, and in doing that, they agree to, when their battery is over 70% and they're not using their device, they become an exit node for your proxy network. So, as an attacker, you can rent out domestic IPs, mobile phone IPs, you can choose a country, you can choose a city. So you can say, this looks like real traffic from domestic IPs in Manchester, or in London, or in the UK, or wherever you want in the world. They're guaranteed to be whitelisted, so they're not going to appear on any of your threat feeds or blacklists. And the other problem is, because that's a real user's device, that user goes to your website to buy something. If you block that IP, they can't buy it. So the concept of a good and a bad IP really is fading away now. And we're actually seeing these hybrid things where an IP can be both good and bad. And it actually depends on almost the session level of that user who's interacting with your site, how they're doing it. Captures, again, an interesting one. There are services out there, like this is an example from 2Capture. For 50 cents, they will solve 1,000 captures for you. And they use real people in different countries around the world, and they actually just send the captures out to them in real time, and they're solving these. See, there's a few seconds delay. Someone types in the words for you, and the capture is solved. So again, this is a problem when we deploy captures, that depending on your risk profile, if there's significant financial gain that can be had from your site, maybe at a basic level, if you have low risk, capture puts people off enough, it's not worth spending any money. But for the sake of 50 cents and 1,000 solved captures, suddenly you can get through. And maybe you can take the cookie that says you've passed the test and replay that, and then suddenly actually you can scale that up and bypass a lot of things and perform a lot of damage because someone thinks from that one test that you're a real user. Same with the user behavioral stuff that we see. Not only do you kind of have those headaches that Scott talked about trading off security and privacy and usability and all these things because you're injecting code into a browser that's trying to monitor all things a user's doing, or on your mobile app, maybe you have to add in an SDK that's a bit invasive and starts asking the user for their location and information about them. So suddenly your simple app is asking for all these permissions and all these problems. And the problem is, anything client-side, and I know you've talked about client-side stuff before, Scott, of when you're validating things. If you're validating the inputs client-side, then taking those and making a decision, an attacker can reverse engineer that. And here's an open source project for an account generator tool that did just that. So one of the large CDN vendors, these guys looked at what JavaScript they were sticking on a page, reverse engineered it, and then wrote in code to bypass those checks. So actually, the user behavioral stuff is fundamentally challenged because you can spoof those responses, you can do all the things, you can do mechanical Turk to get real users to interact with a website and just copy their behavior to look human enough. But also you're asking the wrong question, really. You're asking whether someone's a human or not a human. So not only are you going to filter out people using screen reading technology, for instance, and things like that, but also you're going to start filtering out good bots. So the things you might want on your site, price aggregators, the Google search engines, even partners who interact with your site that way. We've worked with a lot of businesses who didn't even realize the way that partners drive sales to them is by scraping their site. So if you're just making the decision based on whether it's a human or not, that's not always the best thing. And of course, a human can manually sit there and stuff credentials and can perform account takeover attacks. So if you're just asking that question, it's potentially the wrong question to be asking. And the other side of things, there's a lot of tools out there to perform this automatically and make it very easy. Sniper's one that I've been looking at quite a bit recently, and they provide configs, so configurations for popular retail sites. And it's really simple. It costs $20 to buy it, or you can find cracked versions of it on torrent sites. And it sets you up very easily. You find a list of credentials online, you find some free proxy network online, just plug it all in as text files into this tool, and it will go there and it will just try them against major services. And these are big retailers who have some form of bot defense in place, but these guys are constantly reverse engineering what they're doing. They're flying under the rate limits, or they're reverse engineering the tests that they're doing to prove whether they're human or not. And increasingly what we've seen is these configs used to target, the main websites that a user would visit. They've now realized it's easier, and that most of the configs are now rotating looking for APIs. So, even common high street brands and things you would see in any city in the UK, from, bakeries to bookies and then online streaming services, even to Recapture, the service there that sells, solving capture services, there's a config in there to try and credential stuff that. So the attackers are trying to, steal access to these services that are used for more attacks. It's a very bizarre ecosystem, but these tools make it very easy and very low risk for anyone. Any teenager in a bedroom can fire this up and start to gain access to people's Steam accounts, to people's, other online services, streaming accounts, Netflix. All these things are being targeted all the time. The thing to bear in mind as well when we're talking about the bot landscape and your business's risk is there's different levels of risk for different organizations. If you just have a single text-based page, no login forms, nothing going on, then actually you're at a lot lower risk than someone who allows user access, who holds user information behind a login, who accepts payments, who has online ordering, all these kind of things. And what we see is there's a lot of tooling out there that can have quite a dramatic impact on your levels of bot traffic, because the basic bots, the scripts, the search engines, the known botnets, the fake bots, are fairly easy to take out usually, because they just consume resources. They're more of a bother. This is the things people mistake for DDoS a lot of the time. They can add to your operational costs, but actually a lot of the tooling can start to pick those out, the known bad actors. Then as you go up, you see less of them, the commercial bot tools that can be bought online for various different price points, from the very basic things up to very advanced things. And they are capable of, integrating with capture solving services, residential proxy networks. They're good at spoofing devices, and they might be going after some of your public data, for instance. So there's more of a risk there of, your analytics are skewed. They're creating fake accounts. Maybe they're trying to stuff cards into a public portal you have for processing card data with. They're hoarding your inventory so your real customers can't buy it and they're having a bad experience. And then you kind of go up to the advanced threats. So if there's something worth targeting, someone will write a bot or a script to go after it. They'll do the credential stuffing, they'll do account takeover, they'll commit fraud. This leads to data breaches and all kinds of problems. But you'll see that there's a lot less volume of those. So one of the things people often do when they're looking at bot management solutions is they see this huge dip in traffic and think, wonderful, my bot problem is gone. And actually, we go in and then start to look at that and actually analyze it and say, well, actually, you've missed these, where you thought you had no attacks at all. There were these low and slow attacks going on. There were these, credential stuffing attacks that you didn't notice. So it can be very difficult sometimes to approach this. And this is the problem of trying to apply generic rule sets that, your large vendors, your large networks do when they're looking at data across a global scale. Yes, they can pick out the common threads out there. But if someone is just targeting your business, using residential proxy networks, suddenly it becomes a lot more difficult for that global view to be of use to you. So at Netacea, we have a slightly different approach to a lot of people in the market when it comes to bot management. And although this diagram looks slightly complicated at the moment, I'll walk you through it. And it's essentially 3 steps. So we don't want to do anything like Recapture particularly, or user fingerprinting, or deploy lots of code into your web applications. Not only does this take a lot of time for you to build in with your software development lifecycle, and you're trying to validate the security around third-party JavaScript on your site and all these other problems, and following the BA breach, the ticket master problems, a lot of people have concerns around that anyway. And if we look at the way browsers are going, they're increasingly user privacy focused. So the tools that people are using to fingerprint users, they're starting to reduce their effectiveness anyway. So we take the approach of, we look at web logs. So we look at your API logs, your web logs, things you already have in your organization today, and you stream them to us in the cloud, in AWS. And this is where we have our machine learning engine. Now, I don't want to delve too deeply into machine learning and AI because it's a horrible buzzword in InfoSec at the moment. But actually, what we use that for is really a nice use of the technology. We use that to learn how your business logic works on your website, how users interact with it, to build profiles around legitimate ways that people interact with your services. We can do this based on, start to pull out anomalies, strange things that are happening, and we can also start to build up attack fingerprints. So we have, a lot of experience in this area. We've worked with a lot of large vendors. We kind of have a good understanding of how to spot attacks, but with the anomaly detection as well, we can spot new things that are happening, new trends that are out there. And attack fingerprinting is a lot more useful than actual user fingerprinting, because you're trying to determine whether a user's behavior, what their intent is, and which is why we call it intent analytics, whether their behavior is something you want on your site or not. And this is a good way to not only distinguish between a bot stuffing credentials and the poor user who's forgotten their username and password for the 6th time that day and is trying to log in again, but it's also a good way to understand that, well, this bot is hitting me, it is doing some form of scraping, but it actually seems to be, this is a known good bot, this is friendly. And from our experience in our intelligence and our data science and threat team, we actually have a really good understanding of how these things happen. And you'll see at the bottom there's data science support there. So it's not, a magic box you plug into your estate, set and forget, and it just makes bad things go away. The whole point of this is to constantly be learning and evolving based on your traffic patterns. We've seen many vendors come to us and say, well, my previous bot management vendor, we had the problem of we deployed a solution, it worked great, and then suddenly we launched a sale and they thought it was an attack and cut, lots of legitimate traffic off. We have this much better approach where we're learning the way your business flows work. So when we see people come in from the sale, we can understand their intent is to browse and they're doing these things and they fall in line with what we'd expect, where someone just hammering the login path or doing something potentially malicious has a different view on it. And then from the output of that, from that data analysis in near real time that we're doing that in the cloud, we're outputting actionable intelligence. So we're telling you, scores for attackers, for known good bots, for real users. This isn't a deterministic thing. We're giving you ratings and information that you can use in your business to make better informed decisions. So how people consume that, there's 2 different ways of doing it. Primarily, often in the early stages, people want us to feed in with mitigation, so we integrate with your CDM, with your WAF, or we can even do a reverse proxy if you wish, to take mitigation actions on your behalf, to block traffic, to sinkhole it, to redirect it. We can even serve capture if you so wish. But then as we go through this process and evolve it, the most successful thing, and this is more based on your risk. So if you're a really high-risk business, blocking IPs and doing this kind of thing becomes a game of whack-a-mole, and that's where people have fallen down in the past. So what we like to do is provide data feeds and actionable intelligence into your business flows. So we can feed this into your SIEMs, if you use Splunk, something like that. We can feed this into your fraud team because they might want to take action on accounts that are being attacked. If they're seeing huge spikes in credential stuffing, if accounts are being compromised and abused, we can feed that data in. Or the most successful engagements, again, we see people building this into their web application logic. So, this is an attack. We've rated this as a threat. This is a known attacker. This is a bad thing happening. So you want to lock down that account. You want to redirect them to another part of the website. The idea of blocking doesn't really work. If you can stop the attacker getting the data, no matter which IP address or user agent they use, that's a far more effective approach. And that's the whole point of building these web applications, not only with security in mind in terms of patch management and that kind of thing, but actually pulling in intelligence around bots. And that's why we call it smarter bot management. It's this more holistic approach where it's integrated into your own business flow, so you can use that intelligence to stay ahead of the attackers. We see people locking down delivery addresses. So one of the common things with retailers, you get into an account, you change the delivery address, you order goods, something like that, or you transfer points. So retailers and organizations we work with loyalty points might, for example, lock down the delivery address. They might trigger a 2-factor authentication or make you call back to a call center to validate who you are. And suddenly the threat actors can't work around that. And at the same time as you're doing that, your real users who are coming to the system aren't experiencing any friction. They aren't experiencing the slowdown because you're stopping, you can filter out volumetric attacks, you can be very targeted with the sophisticated attacks, you can deal with a broad range of threats there. So although that diagram looks slightly complicated, the whole point is that if you can fingerprint an attack and bad behavior, understand the intent of the traffic visiting your website, and this is where our traditional tools tend to fall down, that they can say, there was this request at this time and this request at this time, what's the story? And that's where the machine learning really comes to play to build profiles of how a user's interacting with it, what is their intent. The other thing is that covers your web traffic, your standard browser traffic, your mobile, your API, because we can see the way that they're interacting. We know normally how a mobile app interacts by making API calls. So suddenly the attacker's doing something different by the rate they're doing it, by, there's a number of signals we monitor using our technology, and we can apply that across all those platforms and suddenly give you actionable intelligence that this attack we saw starting off on your website over here, we've cut them off there, they've rotated, they've come for your API now, so we can really have some impact there. So some summaries and some takeaways from that. Risk modeling. Consider your attack surface when you're thinking about this in terms of your organization. you know, you might be thinking in terms of browser, but what about the API? What about the mobile? What about the partners who interact with you? To, you know, allowing access to accounts or information. And what insight do you currently have into your traffic? Can you look at, you know, your traffic flows today and understand not only what locations they're coming from, but how much of that is automated? How much of that is good automated, bad automated? Do you have any way of understanding the intent of users visiting your site at the moment? Because the majority of organizations really struggle to answer those questions, and yet that's, you know, one of the weakest points from an attack point of view. Define responsibility as well. A lot of organizations, this crosses multiple departments. This is your marketing team, this is your fraud team, this is your e-com platform manager, this is, you know, the operations team, the web developers. It can cross so many different departments that it often falls between the gaps. So you've got to mind that gap and have someone who owns that and, you know, can take that whole business view on what's going on there. And think in terms of business logic. Think how an attacker would go after it. You know, I always encourage development teams when they're building things, not only do the, as a real user, I want to do this story, but the attacker-based user stories where, as an attacker, I want to extract this information. So what steps are in place? Do that threat modeling exercise of what are the boundaries of trust that people are crossing, and how are we going to validate whether that's a legitimate person or an automated attack? And really, you need to start thinking about going just beyond blocking and just, you know, these crude defenses that we have at the moment, where we're going to end up playing whack-a-mole. It's very easy for anyone to scale out. Like you say, Scott, botnets are out there. You can buy access to compromised devices. They're, in the grand scheme of things, relatively easy to spot. We're now seeing these huge numbers of residential proxy networks through mobile apps, through malware, through compromised devices that actually are a lot harder to block, because it could be a real user as well as an attacker, but it allows them to be hugely distributed. So as soon as you cut them off in one place, 5 requests later, they'll rotate and go somewhere else. So you've got to go beyond blocking and think about, when you're building your services and applications, building in that layer of security. So with that, I think we're running just about to time there, Gina.
Almost time, yeah. Time for a few questions.
Okay.
I actually got a couple of things that popped up. I just made some notes there while we were talking, if that's all right. Well, Gina lines up questions from the audience. One of the things that struck me there when we were talking about kind of the, you know, basic IP and the more simple kind of recapture broad stroke mechanisms, you know, it really kind of struck me that actually a lot of people nowadays are starting to turn to things like Tor, where they're using privacy focused services, also like VPNs. Yep. So yeah, it's just, you know, it just kind of like pinged in my mind, and I was like, well, actually, yeah, you know, if a user or many users are using a VPN service for the additional kind of privacy and security, that actually goes more towards the single IP problem, because we're going to see, you know, maybe that IP has a bad reputation because it's a VPN exit point and people use it for bad stuff, or maybe we've got many users coming from that. It's not something that had ever,
you know, you're probably the same as me. As a security researcher, you probably spend half your day coming out through exit nodes all over the place, and every time you go to Google, you're being asked to click on traffic lights and 3 different flavors of llama and all this kind of thing that happen. And it's also the plugins, isn't it? If you think about a lot of people with the privacy focus, you know, in the age of data collection and mass surveillance that people worry about,
so the browser
plugins that kill JavaScript, suddenly you're deemed as a bot because you're not rendering JavaScript.
Yeah, no, it was quite interesting. It just popped into my head as you were going through there. And the other one as well, I think I touched on the term threat modeling a few times, and you also introduced risk modeling as well. I'm always really conscious that as security people, like I find myself using these terms without ever really kind of delving into what they are. And, you know, we casually just mention this term, but, you know, threat modeling at its simplest for me is just identifying where the problems might be. And to do threat modeling, you know, there's no formal process. You don't need like documents. You could literally just sit down with like a pen and paper and be like, okay, like, you know, if we were to list them 1 to 10, what would be our most likely candidates for a problem here? And I just wanted to kind of convey that there's not some big formal process that you have to go, like I'd rather have a threat model that was a notepad with 10 bullet points than no threat model. So, you know, if that's like your first step into this space, and, you know, your first foray into the term of threat modeling, that it can be really simple and easy, and simply going through that process can still yield a huge amount of value. So I just wanted to address that we, you know, I kind of felt like we used it a few times, and, you know, just to reduce that barrier to entry, and that it can be a notepad and a pen and a couple of people having a quick conversation about what are our top 10 things that we would list. And I always find that as a really good exercise.
And that's the key point with it. So when we talk about threat modeling, and when I talk to people about this and risk modeling, whatever I want to call it, you kind of encourage that concept of a risk register, and don't overthink it, get things down there quickly, but list what the impact to your business would be in a 1 to 10 score, and the mitigations you currently have for that. again, 1 to 10, and then you can do a simple formula to work out, okay, so what's the biggest risk and the one we have the least mitigations for, and that rises to the top. Because again, it's often a question of prioritization for people. We talk to them about this bot threat and they go, yeah, but everything's on fire at the moment. I have 10 things to deal with. How do I prioritize? Well, risk register is the easy way to approach that.
I like the diagram as well, like the couple of triangle ones, and I feel almost like those 2 triangles could kind of like slide up and down for different people in that, some people might be able to drag that right one down and really super prioritize like some of the bot layers there, but then for other people there might be somewhat of a gap and less of an overlap in terms of what you need to address or the costing of addressing them. So
absolutely,
that's almost like, I feel, you could kind of take that and slide them up and down a bit to tweak them to where you sit, because all of this is so contextual to what your site does, what your organization's risks are, what you feel is a comfortable level. Because some people may address a risk and say, we believe this is a really big thing for us, and someone else might come to a slightly different solution there and be like, we prioritize the same thing slightly lower. But you've got to go through that exercise of identifying, like, where does this register with us?
Absolutely, and you might have other things in there that mitigate the risk that you are aware of or unaware of. And I think that's one of the problems generally when we talk about the bot management market space. And there's a lot of companies out there who just kind of blanket say bots are a problem and we can solve bots. And actually, it's more nuanced than that. That actually it's building a risk for your organization and what level you need to go to protect your organization.
Absolutely.
So that's actually addressed one of the questions Gene is thrusting this way, which is around how would you approach threat modeling, because you've mentioned that a few times. Someone's just asked a question on actually what is report-uri. Do you want to quickly explain what report-uri does?
Oh wow, so yeah, report-uri, we're a real-time kind of reporting and telemetry service. So nowadays a modern browser has lots of different native functionality built in where it can detect problems and attacks from the client side. So like actual security issues like cross-site scripting, or something really kind of more basic like, hey, your SSL TLS certificate has expired. And the browser now has these native reporting mechanisms where you say, look, if you come to my website and my certificate has expired, it would be really great if you send a report. And actually that JSON payload I showed you earlier was an example of that. So the browser has that functionality built in to dispatch that report. And we are a service that ingests those, does the analysis, gives you graphs and dashboards. So that's probably the elevator pitch of what we do. But yeah, we ingest all of this telemetry from the browsers and then present that to our users in a useful fashion.
Yeah, and I'd recommend people have a look at that site, because it does have, if you are running a website or a service like that, it's really useful information to look at and can be used for a number of purposes. So it's really cool. And then there's a few questions here. They're broadly on the same topic. So how would this work with a CDN provider, providing similar capabilities, some other things about, I already have some sort of solution built into my WAF. So it's basically, how would this work alongside, or layer, or replace? So the thing around this is there's a lot of solutions out there that will talk to you around, we do bot management, bot mitigation. A lot of the time they are kind of like add-ons to your existing services. They are not specialists in this area. So it's that pyramid again. So, they might be able to filter out a lot of the common global attacks, known botnets. A lot of these providers do good research in the area of bots, but when it comes to your individual business, they're not building things around the threats that are targeting you. They're not understanding the way people interact with your website, with your business logic. They're going to try and apply those broad-brush rules. And while that's, a step better than not having any bot management in place, and you might see some huge gains there, in reduction in traffic, because there's some volumetric attacks that are really easy to pick off. We, day in, day out, work with clients who have worked with large vendors who have turned on, the sort of tick box bot solution that they offer as part of the package, and it's done something, but they're still seeing huge volumes of fraud. And especially, it's that risk thing. If you have data in there, personal data, card data, account information, then these big services, they probably aren't as useful to you, because attackers will work around those.
I was just kind of thinking then, yeah, it's like back to the layers thing, really, isn't it? That some people might deploy Recapture and think, hey, like this, this is enough for us, like we're happy here. But some organizations are inevitably, like we've gone through a couple of layers of like rate limiting and Recapture and things like that, and it still feels like there's more to go, right? Like there's more of that journey. So I can totally see how some organizations may take step one and be happy, but then others like us are going to take a couple of steps and think, well, we need actually just to, to take this to the next level. So,
and the problem that you alluded to with rate limiting, which is when you apply something at a global level and a broad brush rule set like that, inevitably what you don't want is false positives. You're not having, we have dedicated
that's my really
teams.
big concern, to be honest, is like if we kill legitimate usage, like that's ultimately, I mean, I guess that's the only risk, right? But that's the big risk. It's like, oh, we've got someone that can't punch in their credit card and sign up. Well, like this is why we're here. So let's,
Exactly.
if we kind of cut to the chase, like we're a business, and I really don't want to harm the usability of our service.
And it's like any kind of technology like that. If you're at the level of you're just offering this as a quick bolt onto your service and you're applying broad brush rules, what you're going to do is dial down the effectiveness to avoid false positives. You don't want to flag a real user, and then the attackers can start to play on the fact that they know exactly where the boundary lies. So in terms of how it stacks up against other things, I think it can complement them. If you can filter things out at a CDN level, that's wonderful, but actually in reality, we find that a lot of organizations we work with have a bigger bot problem than they even realize. And those defenses, although can serve some use, aren't always that effective in the grand scheme of things. Technical question for you by the looks of it, Scott.
Oh, well, yeah, actually, so we've got a couple more here. There's this one that Gina's just passed over to me.
Probably just one more.
Okay, can we grab this one then? There's one more that I've just seen that I want to pick up on. So there was one technical one. How will TLS 1.3 affect this? I wouldn't actually say, so I specialize in TLS, which is why James passed this over to me. I wouldn't say that had anything to do with it, because upgrading from, let's say most people should be on TLS 1.2, which is the encryption protocol we use for HTTPS. I can't see that having any impact, because if we're doing this kind of analysis, it's usually behind the scenes. So like Netacea, you were saying you guys stream logs on the back end, it wouldn't impact there. Anything on the client side, it wouldn't impact there either. So I wouldn't have any concerns or worries around that. But the one that I saw that I also wanted to pick up on was essentially here, he's kind of saying, like hosting is cheap, cloud is cheap. So why can't we just let those bots come and, okay, we've got a few more, I guess the point they're trying to make is like, we've got a few more hits on our website, like we can afford to serve those. And I almost kind of feel like, there's a different element to that there that I pick up on. And this kind of applies to me in report-uri. It's like, there's almost like a responsibility aspect. It's like, if someone's coming to my site and trying credentials, their clear intent is harm. And, I want to stop them wasting our resources and just pounding our login page, but I also don't want these obviously bad people to be successful in their attack either. So I guess there's more than just the cost aspect to this. Is like, if collectively as an industry we can make online crime harder, then overall the global impact of that surely has to be better. I don't want to be used as some kind of vector for bad things.
The reputational damage to an organization from being breached by credential stuffing from someone else's breach can be huge. We've seen a number of large organizations in the past year being hit in the news and getting a bad reputation just because other people's credentials have been stuffed in, users have poor password hygiene. So, that happens all the time. And a lot of people will also say, oh, well, it doesn't matter on my site, I just have, a website that serves gifs of cats doing dances or that kind of thing. Well, that's fine. It's cheap for you to serve resources. But then if bots can come and strip all that content and serve it up somewhere else, and then they can make money on it. So suddenly, actually, your intellectual property, your revenue stream is being stolen. So it's not always as clear cut as we can scale to this with the cloud and it's cheap.
Yeah, I feel like there's more of a responsibility on them, for sure. But I could talk about this all day, James. Like we could sit and have a beer, and I could spend the whole afternoon on this with you. So
yeah, conscious of time, but thanks very much, guys. Particular thanks to Scott for joining us today. It's been really interesting to hear your experiences, and I hope everyone tuning in has found it helpful. As mentioned earlier, we'll be sharing a recording of the session in the coming days, so please watch out for that. We are also shortly publishing a helpful new resource called The Ultimate Guide to Bot Management, and we'll share this with you as well. If you do have any further questions on today's session or would like to speak to someone from the Netacea team, please do contact us via hello@netacea.com or visit us online at netacea.com. And thank you all very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.